Hello, nifty knitters. Today we are going to start to learn how to knit. So I brought some pieces here to show you before we get started because I know that some of you are crocheters and I thought it would be good to compare and contrast so you get an idea of what we're doing differently when we are learning how to knit. So the first thing that's different is that I would say, in my own words, that crochet is kind of self-contained. So this is a piece that I'm working on with those that are learning how to crochet, and this is 4 rows of single crochet. What I mean by self-contained, it's the stitches are locked in. So we talked about in the crochet video that these hearts that are made, but basically these are knots. And I can even take this needle out, pull this up a little bit, take this out. The work can sit by itself, and I don't have to worry about it unraveling unless you actually pull the thread. Knitting is quite different. So let me show you that. I brought an example of a scarf. Let me tighten this again. I brought an example of a scarf that I've been working on. This is using my larger needles that are with the tube, if you watched my first video that talked about tools. But just to show you, the stitches stay on the needle. This is why that most of your knitting stitches or your knitting needles have an end. So this is my little piggy end. These big purple ones that we're going to use today actually have a metal stopper on the end. So this is so that the stitches do not slip off. Quite literally slip off. So you have to always be careful when you're working your knitting so that the stitches don't fall or you, quote, drop a stitch, because once they do, they actually unravel all the way down unless you catch them. And there's a way to fix that, and when we finally get to that spot, I'll show you how to do that. But for the most part, know that the stitches have to stay on the needle, and if you remove the needle, the whole thing will fall apart. The other interesting thing to know about, or the difference between knitting and crochet, is that for the most part, crochet, unless you're doing really decorative stitches, it doesn't really matter if it's a front or a back. So if I flip this over, you can see the back or the front. I'm just calling it back or front, but they pretty much, even if I flip them this way, look the same. Here's even a piece that I did years ago. I was making a blanket, and this is a modified granny square, but basically you would make, I don't know, 200 of these and then stitch them together. But just to show you that even though it's 3 different types of yarn, it's the same on either side. You really can't tell unless you're looking for something. You really can't tell what the difference is. Knitting is different. Knitting has a front and a back, unless you're doing the garter stitch, which this is in. So as you can see here, the front and the back all look the same. But all the other knit stitches have a front, and you have to pay attention to what the front is, because if you're doing something called the stockinette stitch, you have to always knit the knit rows and purl the purl rows, and otherwise your knitting will get all out of whack and it won't look right. But we'll get to that. That's next lesson. We're not there yet. The other thing to note is that in crochet, the stitches grow in height. Even like one stitch grows. So for instance, this is single crochet. If you were doing a half double, which we'll learn next time, it's a little taller, and the double crochet is even taller, and then the half treble, and then the treble is even bigger than that. And as they grow, so these are all done with double crochet stitches for this particular piece, grow meaning this way. So this was just one round of this color, and this was just one round of this color. They're larger in height. And as they grow taller, they become a little bit more airy, and they're not as compact as with the single crochet. Knit is different. Knit does not, when you're making rows, obviously it's growing, but the stitch itself does not grow. It pretty much stays stable the whole entire piece. So you're not wrapping to add yarn to make it taller. You can obviously add stitches or decrease or increase or do things decorative. This piece has a hole in it on the side, as you can see it. So you're skipping stitches here, or you're making one to create a decorative edge. But for the most part, the stitches themselves are not growing in height. So that's the basic difference. So let me move all of this stuff out of the way because we are about to cast on and get our work ready to go. So, oh, by the way, to store this, usually my knitting, I take the working yarn And I literally, so you'll learn this when you have to do your homework, I take the needles and I stick it in there. That way nothing unravels. So we can just move this whole piece out of the way. Okay. So we are going to learn how to do the very first piece of work. I'm using larger needles so that you can see what I'm doing. Our first piece of work, we're going to make a scarf, and the scarf is going to consist of different stitches. So we'll do 6 rows of each new stitch that we learn, and eventually it'll be long enough to wear. So I'm using these larger needles today just to show you how to do the motion, but then I'll finally cast them onto smaller ones, so my work will be the same size as yours. So to cast on, the first thing you want to do is create a slip knot. So if you watched my crochet video, it's the same exact slip knot that you start your crochet with. So I pulled some yarn off the skein, so I just have a little bit here to work with. And let's take a look at what a slip knot looks like. So I have the end of the yarn here. I'm going to pull that through to create some tension, and I have all the other yarn over here. And now many people do this in different ways, but this is how I create my slip knot. So I hold it, take my pointer, and I just pull up a loop, and I roll it over on itself. So basically all I'm doing is crossing the yarn. So I can take my finger out, you can see that the yarn is now crossed. Pinch it so it doesn't unravel, and then just fold it down on itself, just like that. And then reach in between and pull this piece of yarn up. And then take the bottom and this new piece of yarn, and that's hard to do when you look through the camera, but there you go. You just grab them and you pull. And that creates the slip knot. Why it's called a slip knot is because if you pull on it, it moves up and down. So thus the slip knot. So to cast on, I'll show you my way. There are many different ways to cast on. Some do where you don't even create a slip knot. Some wrap the yarn around their fingers in a really cool way with a long end and maneuver the needle back and forth to wrap it around. I'll show you that another time. This is just to show you the basics so that you can understand the mechanics. And then once you get the mechanics of how this is going onto the needle, then you can figure out the best way to do that for yourself. But I have my slip knot. I am taking my first needle and I'm just sliding it in there. So it is on that loop. And what I want to do now is tighten it. So I just pull it up to tighten it. And I'm actually moving it around a little bit so that my end is not so long. So there we go. It is on there. So there are different ways to knit. Before I show you the actual stitches, I'll just show you the mechanics. So there's the US way to knit. So the US way, basically what they're doing, they're crossing the needles, and then you're taking yarn and you're wrapping it around the needle. So you're literally, the yarn is feeding from the right, if you're right-handed, and you actually do this each stitch. You stick them in here to cross them, you wrap, and then you do a maneuver, right? I've learned years ago how to knit continental, which means because I'm a righty, the yarn feeds from the left side, and I hold the yarn with my left side. If you are a left-handed person, it's just the opposite. So your needle will be over here, and your yarn will be over here, and you will be feeding from your right, and the needle will be over here on your left. I haven't mastered left-handed yet, but I'm slowly teaching myself for those lefties on here who need to learn. So we'll see soon how this works. So what we want to do, let me rearrange my yarn back and put it back in my other hand. So how I hold the needle is much like how I hold the crochet needle and the crochet yarn. So I take my pinky and lay the yarn over it, put my hand flat, and wrap, wrap. So now I have the yarn loaded in my hand. So it's just kind of threaded through pinky and my finger. That's how I keep my tension, so it's nice and tight. Knitting, it's important, much like crochet, that you have the same tension throughout. Otherwise, your work will start to be baggy in certain places and tight in other places, and tension comes with time, so you just have to keep practicing that you're maintaining the tension. So to cast on, here's the end dangling over here, all the feeding yarn is over here. You take your needle, and what we want to do is you're kind of working behind this stitch. And I know it's hard to see this way with the angle of the camera this way, but I can try to play with it to see what happens. But all that I'm really doing is coming in the back of this loop, right? So this is actually, this slip knot is 1. So this is your first knit stitch on your needle. You come in the back and you finagle with your fingers to get it in there. And then, so I'm crossed behind. So if you can see in there, I have that needle point in that hole, right? So I'm gonna, now in crochet, the hook is on here. So in the crochet, you grab it this way because the hook hooks, right? In knitting, you have to grab it the other way because that way it wraps around and it won't fall off. So you come around, so needle to the top, wrap it around, and then you're gonna pull it through. Now you have to get your middle finger involved to hold this end down, and you're gonna pull up a loop, and then you're gonna put it on. So I put it on this way, and you tighten. Now you have to be careful here that you're not twisting your stitches when you do this, and it will take some time before you figure out if you are or not. But then you just keep going, right? So we wrap again. I got my dangly down here. We're going to go into the second loop that's on there. So this, now you have 2 knit on there. You pull this, you stick this in, so it's in there again. You grab some yarn, and you pull it up, and then you put it on. So now you have 3. So let's keep going. We're going to get ourselves 30 on here, and once we have 30, we'll start our very first stitch, which is the knit stitch. So coming around, now notice that, so twisting it would mean I'm putting on like this. Remember, look, I'm going on backwards like that and tight. All right, so I have 28 on here, and I have to do the last 2 to get to 30. So notice that there's a nice ridge that's created, and that's created as you turn the yarn onto the needle. And if you watch the crochet video, these are actual crochet hearts on the bottom. It's magic how that happens, right? But so I have 28 on here, so I have to do 2 more to get to 30. So just to go in again, I have my yarn locked and loaded on my hand. I'm coming under this stitch, turning it to you so you can see, grabbing some yarn, and then pulling some up and getting on there and tighten. So that's 29, and then adjust if you need to. I always like to make sure that my little ridge is all lined up. Yes, I'm a goofball like that. And then we go for the last stitch. So I'm coming in again, show you from this angle, grabbing some yarn, showing you from this angle, coming through, and then I'm putting it on there. So there is 30 on there. Okay, so we're going to learn the very first stitch. It's the easiest stitch to learn. It is the knit stitch. And when you knit every single row, that is called the garter stitch. So that was that piece of work I showed you a few minutes ago. That was the blue piece of work. So as I mentioned too in the beginning, that basically all we're going to do is transfer the stitches from this side to this needle. So let's begin. Now, again, I knit continental. So to do that, I lock and load again the same way that I always do. So we're going to start knitting the stitches. Now how this is different than cast on is that instead of putting the loop onto this needle, it's going to be transferred over to this needle. So we go in from underneath, going behind again, much like we just did when we cast on. We're going to grab some yarn. We're going to come through. And now the loop is over here, and we're literally going to let this loop that's on here come off, and we tighten. So now we have our loop over here. And now you have to readjust. It's hard to do this with like really large needles because the stitches are loose, but thus begins our work. So if you hold it this way, maybe you can see it better this way. We're coming underneath, we're grabbing some yarn, pulling through, pulling off. going underneath, grabbing some yarn, pulling through, pulling off. So we've done 3. Under, over, off. Under, grab some yarn, come through, off. So this is why I say that continental is faster, because if you're knitting the US way or the wrap method or the throw method, sometimes it's called, the yarn will be coming from the other side and you literally have to like come through, you stop, you grab the yarn, wrap it around, all kinds of crazy things happen. But basically I'm going under this piece of yarn, so this is that loop on there. Notice how I keep maneuvering my hands. And this is where you get that clicky, clicky, clacky from the knitting, right? So I'm coming under, grabbing some yarn, pulling through and off. And you keep tightening with your other hand. So here we go, under, grab, off. Make sure I'm keeping my hands in the frame of the camera so that you can see what I'm doing. There we go. So under, grab some yarn, and off. And then you can straighten these guys out. So now I have them on both sides because I'm transferring from this side to this side. So we're going under, grabbing some yarn, and pulling that stitch off. Yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. And arrange as you need. So under, yarn, off. Now if you pull them far enough apart, you can actually maneuver it so it's much, much easier. See, have my finger far enough away with the tension that I just have to twist the needle, pull it, and come right off. So under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. Okay, so almost all of the stitches are over here now. Let me get some yarn so it's not all bunchy. There we go. So how many do I have to do? I have 3, 6, I have 9 more to do. So again, we're going under, grabbing some yarn. Oops, I grabbed too much yarn. Go under, grab some yarn, and pull that off. Go under, grab some yarn, pull that off. Under, yarn, 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 off. And then the very last stitch, which was your slip stitch, or your slip knot, I should say. Under, yarn, and then it comes off. So now all of the stitches have been transferred over here. Now notice this is where knitting gets, so it looked kind of small on the needles, but if you actually spread this out, and it's kind of bunched here too, it is pretty big. So 30 stitches is not something as small as you think. So I'm just arranging things, making sure that all the little loopies are on the bottom, like these bubbles, because this is your knit right here. All right, so now we're gonna go back the other way. So what do? We literally take the needle and turn it around. And we go backwards. So we did 1 row. We lock our knit in, or use our hand, to load the yarn. And we do the exact same thing. So you have to feed them up a little higher so they come off much easier. But we're going to do our second row of garter stitch. So I'm coming in underneath. Use your thumb to hold it. Grab some yarn, if I can, and then pull that loop off. So you go under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, and then pull that off. Under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. Under, yarn, off. All right, so keep going. Let's do, I said 6, but let's go 8. Let's put 8 stitches, or 8 rows, I should say, on here of 30. Now this is where it's a little different than crochet, because crochet you have to pay attention to what stitch am I going in? Am I going into the right hearts or the right stitch? Whereas this, you just do all the ones that are on the needle, right? And you don't have to count, you don't have to worry. So this is where you've seen the recent literature that talks about how knitting is meditative, because you're just kind of sitting here, moving your hands. You can watch TV as you do this, but it's a process, right? So there you go. So I'm almost finished this first, or actual second row, right? So this is our second row. So I'll have 6 more to do, because we're going to do 8 rows total. So once you are finished, go ahead and post your 8 rows on the Facebook account, on our group, because I would love to see your work in progress. I'm just going to drop these down here. So here we go, and I'll transfer this work onto the smaller needles so it'll match yours. But that is the garter stitch.